I made a painting a day for 30 days in a row in the hopes that I would learn how to use material that is gouache paint, which is just mysterious and challenging and interesting and weird and never does what you want it to do. That's a sneak peek, by the way, for how this has gone. Can you, with only the knowledge of oil painting, like this thing and other things that I have over here, can you make a gouache painting that is beautiful and interesting and also controlled and not an accident? And can you do it from making 30 paintings, one a day, every day, for 30 days in a row? And that's the answer I found out in the last month here on Brushwork. Friends and foes, welcome to Brushwork Podcast. My name is Stephanie Scott, and today I'm telling you about my adventures trying to learn gouache. Gouache is this interesting medium. It's creamy, it's reactivated by water, it is super fussy. It picks up pigment when you don't want it to pick up, it puts down pigment when you want it to pick up pigment. It is hard to mix, and yet it creates these really beautiful paintings that I am just dying to make and dying to try to make. Way back in 2017, I saw someone using gouache paintings when I was at an art residency, and it blew my mind how lively she could make these paints work for her. I was like, what is this pigment? This kind of looks like watercolors, but it's not watercolors. And she's like, it's gouache. You should try it out. And I tried it out way back then, and I made a hot mess, and then I gave up. Does that sound like you? So flash forward to 2024, I'm starting the Summer Art Marathon, which is a summer-long challenge to try and get better at whatever craft you've chosen, and I've chosen gouache paint. And I thought, okay, here's the plan. I'm gonna make a copy of a master painting, but like make it really tiny. I've even got like a little sketchbook for it. Here it is, it's right here. Okay, I'm gonna fill the sketchbook up with little gouache paintings of master copies, and then like an original here and there to like see where I am at and see if I can master this medium in 30 days. It was hard. I wasn't good at it, but it was a lot of fun. Okay, here we go. Before I show you the results of everything that I've done here, I should tell you about the medium I'm using, about gouache. Gouache is an interesting paint. I've been using Schmincke paint, which is this German-made gouache paint. It is not acrylic-based. There are two kinds of gouaches, one that is acrylic-based and one that is not. True gouache is not, and can get you a little bit duller colors than acrylic gouache. You know those paintings you see from illustrations on Instagram? They're like, it's gouache paint. It's usually acrylic gouache. It's usually very vibrant and very beautiful, and you can't reactivate it with water. That's the difference. I wanted something that you could reactivate with water. I wanted something that would lend itself well to master copies. All right, so I chose about, how many colors do I have here? So I chose 17 colors, including black and white. And I put in a big order, and it was kind of expensive, but I'm learning that a little gouache goes quite a long ways. Also, during my gouache adventures, I was traveling, and I thought, okay, I'm going to be going here, there, and everywhere. I need to be able to take a medium that can be put into a little suitcase and taken with me. I learned a lot about how gouache travels, which is sort of well. So I have here my little gouache. Oh, look, it has a little thing on the back. I didn't know that before. I have here my little palette where I poured my gouache paint into. I opened this up and I found my little half pans that I got from a watercolor supplier. And here we are. Shall I show you the details? When you first get your tube of gouache, it comes in a tube like this. You have your cadmium red here. When it is in the tube, it's quite liquid and not hard at all, which is very nice. I've never tried mixing from its liquid state, which is a project I'll probably try next. Instead, I poured it out into these little half pans in my little Rembrandt tray I have here. When you open it opens up like this. I've got two sides for mixing, and I've got all these half pans. Each of these half pans has color that I've poured in. So I would have taken this and poured it into my red, and then I let it dry for 2 days. One thing about gouache is that when you pour it into the pan, it tends to crack as it dries. You'll notice here on my green, I have lots of crevices in the paint that's not from how I've been using my brush. It's from how the paint dried after I poured in the original tube of color. This is interesting for traveling, as if you're not careful and you don't keep saturating the paint with water, you're going to get paint that pulls away from the pan and starts to crumble and will get lost in your palette. Traveling with gouache is great if you are using it every day. It's a material that really wants to stay wet and to have some sort of binding to it so it doesn't just completely crumble apart. I had a mistake the first time I poured gouache onto a palette. It wasn't in a fully formed pan. It was it had like a slope to it, and the color completely fell apart, didn't have anything like a wall to cling onto, and ended up going all over my luggage. It was a complete pain. So if you're going to do this, I highly recommend getting these half pans. Let me pull one out for you here, or maybe two. These pans are for watercolors. These are half. They also come in double size, so they're full pan size like this, where they would just be one section, but mine are half, and you can pour the color. I recommend that when you pour the color, you fill up the pan and then give it a little tap on the ground out here, just kind of like that, and that will let it fill out all the way to the corners and have something to hold on to. And then when it's dry, you just pop them in like that, and abracadabra, you have a pan full of gouache colors. One thing I have not tried is mixing them with watercolors, and I don't think they mix well, so I wouldn't recommend it. And I'm excited to get some new colors. You see I have 6 empty pans here. I actually have spots for 2 more. We'll see if I end up continuing with this after the summer and want some more colors. One major thing I notice about gouache color is that some pigments reactivate better than others. So when I pour my dark blue, my indigo here, it reactivates super well, which means that every time I go to pick up some pigment with my paintbrush, you get quite a bit of it every time on your paintbrush. I was actually kind of alarmed by how fast I was going through my black. I'm almost at pan over here, and I was like, why am I using so much black? This is not a color I use very often when I'm painting, especially with my oil paints. I almost never use it. But with gouache, it was disappearing so quickly, quicker than my white even. And it's because the black picks up really well once reactivated. The pigment really clings to your brush versus this yellow here, which I've used in almost every single painting. It doesn't care to be picked up and reactivated. So you have to really dig for it more. This makes color control really difficult, and I'm going to show you in a demonstration in a little bit here how this is working out. One thing I really love about this watercolor pan, this tin pan, is that it's really easy to get your spray bottle and spray some color. I've got this metal one. It's super lightweight, and I empty it out when I'm traveling with it, but you just give it a little spritz, and you're ready to go. How fun is that? Let's talk about brushes now. I've been using these Princeton Select brushes for my gouache paints, and they've been pretty fantastic. One thing I've really noticed with gouache is that it's nice to dedicate one color per brush. So I've got a couple of these flats here, and I have even more in my little bucket over there, where this one is obviously for my really dark colors, and this one I've been keeping just for my yellows. Having one brush per color, or even per color family, has given me cleaner colors. If you're working on a gouache painting and you're finding things get really muddy, I highly recommend devoting one brush per color to help separate things. One thing I've really noticed when it comes to brushes and gouache is that your brush shape really matters when it comes to how you're applying your paint. The gouache is going to take whatever shape your brush is to an extreme. With oil paint, you can get a lot more variety of shapes, you can get a lot more softness, simply because oil has a lot of body to it. It has a lot of texture, whereas gouache is mostly liquid. It's mostly like watercolors. So having a variety of shapes, having a round, having a flat, having all these filberts, it's really, really handy. Also, highly recommend having a brush that's just for water, a mop brush, something that is good for wetting the page. so your pigments don't get scratchy. This is the watercolor paper I used. I liked something that was a little bit cold pressed. I wanted something that was easy to travel with. I wanted something that encouraged me to stay in my size limit of 4 by 6 inches. So I found this watercolor book by Winsor and Newton. I find that watercolor paper is great for gouache, and I'm going to try a hot press one next to see if I can get a little bit less texture in the paper, because texture does show up. I'm now going to flip through my sketchbook and show you how everything went, and we're going to do day 30 together. I did this painting. This was my first transcription I've done in several years. And as a reminder, a transcription is a copy of a master painting that is forgoing most details. When I did this painting, I had never seen the original up close, and I actually did this when I was in London, and the next day I got to go see this painting, and I was like, oh boy, am I super far off. I learned a lot about opacity here, and a lot about how things bleed. Really interesting. There was a lot of shapes that I was getting. You can see that I was only using the flat top brush for the majority of this painting, and I regret not switching brushes. I could have used a rounder brush to get some more softness and get more depth into this painting. Overall, the composition is fine. It's not great, and everything is so like lime green that it hurts me a little bit to look at. The next day was dedicated to this painting, which is the mirror. And I'm going to admit a secret to y'all here. I'm not a portrait painter. I don't do figures. I'm mostly an abstract painter here. I'm going to show you on the screen something I actually do. Look at that. Amazing. And and this was really challenging for me. There was a lot of browns here that threw me off. There was a lot of reds here that threw me off. It was very telling here that I was trying to do something alla prima and then messed up. You can see a lot of like darkness here. That's from me trying to draw a line with the paint and then messing up and then trying to go over it later and get a nice like smooth finish like I did over here. Didn't work. You gotta try again. There's so many like little lessons like that. Let's go on to the next. This was my day 3. I was trying with lightness here. When you're working with gouache, you have to really take charge of what you're looking at and really experiment and not be settled with the final result if you don't like it. Thin coats of paint, very challenging, wouldn't recommend. However, we got to day 4 and I was like, oh, I feel a breakthrough. This is called The Veil of Rest, and it's about 2 nuns burying a third. And here I learned about layering in a way that I hadn't before. I got some interesting movements here in the back on the hedge, and I thought, okay, if I can really cut in the shadows in a way that I hadn't before, I'm gonna get some distance happening that I definitely did not have in the last couple pieces. Day 5 was a day of frustration, and I think you can see it when you look at this. This is the harvest dinner. And I knew with the transcription, you're not trying to paint people or windows or, teeny tiny little details. You're trying to get the general color shapes. And I think I did that to a degree that is successful, but also you can see how frustrated I was getting with the browns. I think this painting would have been very different if I had copied something that was also clean of yellow varnish, which when you looked at this painting, it's extremely yellow. But we live and learn. I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly from here on out. This is day 6, trying a cloudscape. It looks like mountains. Try again. Learning how to do a wispy cloud here over some blues was a lot, and I didn't get it. But I learned how to not do it, and that's a step forward. I hope you see my encouragement happening here towards myself. I tried a crow here, trying to get some wispy shapes. You can't get wispy shapes with wet on wet. You can't do it. And then once you try wet on dry, you have to get the right brush. And I failed on both of those accounts, but I learned something. When we got to day 8, I felt like I was getting a little bit more control with my color mixing. I was starting to experiment more. I was starting to get dirtier with my brushes. I was starting to get a little bit more into what could I do with this color to get this feeling, and thinking about color relationships. In this day in particular, you can see I'm getting some lightness happening on the skin texture. And I was like, okay, if I layer the lightness, can that work in getting actual feeling of light? And what's really interesting about gouache is that when you add white to your mixture, it pales things out more than brightens it. And that's a lesson that I have learned over and over with oil color, that brightening things doesn't mean adding white. It means adding other colors to it. And that was kind of like another slap in the face of you're doing your bad habit again. And what a delicious reminder of my weaknesses, right? Seeing the same habit show up when I do my oil painting as when I do my gouache painting and vice versa. Okay, there's a lesson to be learned there. Will she learn it? Find out next time. I kind of liked how vague the background is. I think I actually was listening to the values here of what was happening in the real painting versus what I thought would happen in real life. We love to see it. Around here we have day 10, another landscape. I was very half-hearted with this one, and you can tell. All right, when we get to day 11, this is my first original piece, and I was like, okay, I feel like I've learned something here. I feel like we have something interesting happening, and this was also the day that I started looking up the Sleeping Beauty backgrounds. You know Disney's Sleeping Beauty, and they have those amazing, beautifully painted backgrounds? Those are all in gouache paint. And they're all painted similar to this. And I was like, ooh, I want to try and emulate some of this. So I started off with a nice dark green background, and I got really into layering. This day, day 11, was a day that I let myself look at layering in a way that was more like oil painting than anything else. I finally was like, okay, if I let the whites get really thick, like really, really thick, and I can paint them over, maybe it won't pick up the pigment from underneath, which has happened when I had done thinner paint washes before. I got some interesting shadows happening, I got depth happening, and this was the first day where I was like, okay, I'm actually learning how to use this pigment. So, you know, if you try really hard, you can learn gouache paint in 11 days. Day 12, I was feeling energized, and I was like, let's try another. And this one was less successful. When I see this one, I see a misunderstanding of where the light source was coming from, but I do see a playfulness that wasn't there in other paintings. I abandoned the transcriptions for a few days here because I wanted to see if I could do something original and botanic in a way that I hadn't approached before. I do like this painting. It's less successful, but I do like it, and I think if I had lightened up the sky in this corner, everything else would have been more convincing. It's fun to have a play on brushstroke. It's fun to have a play on color. You'll see here my frustrations on getting a nice light pink that also wasn't pale, and I didn't get it, but maybe it's because I need a different pigment of pink. That's something also you should question. If you feel like you're getting frustrated over and over with the pigments, think about, okay, I've got this carmine, I've got this manganese, I've got this magenta, I've got this cadmium. Am I missing a color that these can't answer? That might be the case. For me, I was missing a turquoise, and I bought it soon after. I went back to my transcriptions after this, and you can see what I learned from doing the original onto this one. I got a lot thicker with the paint, and I got a lot more impatient with the paint also. When you do these really thick layers, they take time to dry, and if you don't let them dry, you start getting mishaps happening. Day 15, I got really thin again because I got scared from the last painting. I was like, okay, I need to do something that is really light and get something that has almost no layering down, so I chose a really light painting to copy. This one turned out too yellow, but also too gray. I feel like the color harmony is way off, and that's the lesson I learned. Day 16, I did a still life. This is from Apples and Primroses, and I loved how this turned out, even though the colors are extremely off and it didn't work out. What I really learned here is that the colors when wet are very, very different than the colors when they're dry. I spent about an hour and a half on this painting, and I tried to wait between layers, and then I was like, great, it's done. And then I came back to it 20 minutes after I thought it was done, and I saw this tablecloth here that's supposed to be bright white, and I was like, didn't get that done. After that, I reached the end of my book, so I went back to the front and started on the front side. I tried a Morandi. Morandi is tough because his landscapes are perfect. His landscapes are perfect. I mean, I guess they're perfect, but his still lives are very precise. And I was like, okay, I'm going to try and get something here where it's vague and it's interesting and try not to see the shapes. I don't want to see a matchbox or a tin can or a vase. I only want to see shapes. And I squinted my little heart out. I think we did okay. The lights here, I missed. I kept trying to pull the pigment back up on these shapes here. Didn't happen. That's okay. We tried, and I think it actually has color harmony for once, even though it's missing the light. This painting, I got the proportions wrong on this person, and I think that's a lesson that I'm learning right now as I'm speaking this. When I'm doing a person, I tend to get the proportions more off than when I get a landscape. And it's because I start thinking of them differently. I think, oh, there's a person, and I start thinking that's an arm, and that's a scythe, and that's a leg. And instead of being like, what is the whole picture doing together? This was day 21. I chose a very blue painting. This was a portrait, and it's okay. You can see I used only one brush here, and I should have used more. This painting was another example of things drawing a lot darker than I thought. I knew the ocean was dark, but I also knew the top of this boat had a blazing sun on it, and the pants on this person were supposed to be white, and the skin was supposed to be a lot more sun-bleached, and yet, here we are. I really like how I got these illusions of sharks going on here, and I like how red the water is on there. So we're making some wins, but we're also not making wins. This was my first abstract original, and I wanted to do something that had to do with layering. I wanted to do something that had to do with this bright color work, and I'm still trying to get that bright pink, which I am missing the pigment from, that I really need for this. And it didn't work out. I think it's kind of interesting, but mostly it doesn't feel cohesive and it doesn't feel convincing. And I didn't have a big of a plan for this one as I did with the others. And that's good to know. Thinking ahead with gouache paint is pretty critical. Day 24, y'all know this one. I feel like between this one and the other portrait I did with the blue, this one has a lot better color control. And it's a lot more muted, and it's too green on the bottom, but I got the composition a lot better than I have in the past. And that feels like we're growing. Day 24 and it's working? What? Who am I? This is the last transcription I did of the challenge, and this was a market scene. Again, not understanding how the blue was working, not understanding this color relationship. The sky was dark, but not this dark compared to the building. And that's things I started to notice as I was painting them. This whole thing should have been a lot lighter, but to do that, I needed to mix my colors more effectively before I put them on the page. Mixing your colors before you put them down is the most important thing with gouache. You cannot take them right out of the tube. You cannot go in without mixing. It doesn't work out, and you're going to get punished for it when you try to layer things on top. My last 3 paintings I did were originals. This one was a treescape that I did on Twitch. It started out one way. I kept pulling out pigment from the page after applying it down. It's interesting. One thing about gouache is it can be forgiving if you know how to use your brush. You can scrub literally the paint off of the page, but you will see a ghost of it. And I think you see that here and here very obviously. I tried to doing a layering pattern here. I put these little details in last. Overall, I don't love it, but I think it's not a total failure, as some of my other pieces have been. Choosing this purple and blue, choosing to put a hot blue underneath a purple wash does give it a vibrancy, and I'll be playing with that kind of saturation later on. On this day, I really played with a gradient. Now, if you don't know my work, I am very into gradients and into geometry and color control. And this was the first time I really took seriously, can I make a gradient step that is consistent? And with this day, the answer is no. Yes, it has color harmony and it looks intentional. What I was trying to get was this brown color into black in not one line, but I was trying to get into 3 lines. And I didn't get there. I got all the way up to here, and then I was like, we're already at black. I have to change colors again. Learning how each pigment changes colors and changes steps, and learning how to mix the color on the pan without losing the pigment out into a puddle is so challenging, and it's probably the hardest part of the whole thing. For the last painting, I finally tried the method where I mixed the paint in this little bottle here, and it worked out. This is a painting that uses white into dark indigo, and I think it worked quite well. The white disappeared fairly quickly, and the indigo wanted to be picked up just a little bit at a time, and you'll see I get stuck in this mid-range for quite a while. However, I was able to get into some darks after I cut the color. That's a method I use when I'm oil painting, where I will take whatever pile of paint here, in this case it was this in this tube, and I will remove some of it in order to get some more color that I'm going towards into the pile. Does that make sense? I'm literally cutting out some of the color from the color pile and using that smaller amount to mix into the new shade. It worked well. I liked this color gradient. The background weirds me out a bit. It's not exactly what I was going for, but as an experiment, 10 out of 10. For this last painting, I'm going to use this final page in my sketchbook that I've got. I'm taking my brush here and I'm mopping it down. You'll see that I accidentally picked up color from this page in front of it with this green spot, and that's because I was impatient and closed the book before it was dry, so don't do that. As a consequence, I'm gonna let the color of the background be this green because I need to mask it. So here we go. While this green background dries, I'm going to set it to the side, and I'm going to show you some mixing techniques that I've learned. So first, you're going to get yourself a little cup of water here. I've got a little bit of a gray color in it right now, and that's fine. It's not going to change the pigments too much. And I'm going to show you what it's like to do some reds. For today's painting, I'm thinking a red into teal would be really interesting, and I've got just a little bit of teal left, so I think this will be fine. So first, I'm going to clean a part of my palette. I think this one would be good up here. So first I just get it wet. I've got some color here. I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to mix it up here so I can remove it from the palette. Before you start a new painting, I highly recommend cleaning your palette, or at least cleaning parts of it so you have some space to use. I'm actually thinking about getting a second palette to use while I'm painting. I've got a rag up here. This rag is my gouache painting rag. I will wash it eventually, but for now, it's doing its job. Okay, so I'm just going to absorb the color. Okay, so watch first what happens when I use this red here. Let's grab some. And I got my red, and I'm mixing it like this. Okay, so watch what I get. So I'm grabbing some red, and I'm mixing it like this. Now you'll notice immediately that it kind of spreads out with the surface tension from the pan, right? And you mix, and let's say I want to add in some pink. So I wet my pink a bit. I'm going to grab some water, wet it down, and I wet it, and I'm like, okay, I want to mix. Now, do you see how the color is mixing right in the middle of that pile? I got my pink, it's mixing in right in the middle, and it's pushing out a lot of the pigment to the side. That's something I've noticed when I was working on this for the last 30 days, is that a lot of the red pigment gets pushed out to the side if I stay in the middle here. Whereas if I were doing a oil paint, I'd be able to scrape up the sides and put it in. So what I have to do now is I have to go out here to the sides to mix in this whole new color. Let me show you with a darker color. I'm gonna grab some, so I've got some purple, I'm gonna mix in. And now the pink is going even further out. In order to get everything, I have to expand the circle that I'm mixing in. And I've got this new color, but also my circle for mixing is thicker. What happens now is that the outside edges are going to dry first, and that color won't be picked up as much when I'm trying to mix in an even darker color. So we're going to wait a second, and then I'm going to come back and start mixing the new color so I can show you what I mean. If you look at this color, you can kind of see how the edges have dried a bit. Look at this. You see how it's not shiny? That matters when you're mixing colors. So now when I try to add more purple to the middle, and I've got this nice and wet here, it's still pushing color out to the edges, and I still have to make a bigger circle. And now I have to reactivate the edges in order to make the new color. And if I'm going fast and I'm painting quickly, that's not something I want as a priority. So instead, I've thought of this new method, which I think is going to work out if I want the color control, which I know I do. We take our little circle. I've got a couple of these now. I was like, this is genius. I need more of these. So I got myself a little jar. It's so cute. And now I'm going to try this again. I'm going to wash out my brush, and then I'm going to pick up some red. And you'll notice that I'm holding it at an angle here. That's not so you can see it. It's so the puddle of color stays in this little crux here. Okay, so I want my first color to be red, and I'm really controlling where it is in the jar. Yeah? Okay, so I'm gonna put down a little color here. We'll go squares today. And now that I have this red, put a little bit more in the jar, I'm gonna move it towards the teal. And the teal gets picked up so quickly because this color is just like, yeah, put me on the painting. I want to be everywhere. And you're like, okay. So here we go. I'm gonna douse the color of the teal in my little box here, and I'm going to pick up just a little bit of it on my brush. Even this right here might be too much, but now when I mix it in, I'm mixing it at this pinpoint. It's not a big circle, and I'm getting really good color control. That also was a lot faster than mixing on the pan. So now let's do it again. Get a little bit. I hope that's too much. You see how hard it is to control how much pigment you're picking up? And then you mix it into my little tube. And we go even darker. I'm going to keep doing this until I get all the way to teal. It's taking me seconds with this little jar to change the color, versus on the pan it took so many swishes. When I've got too much paint on the brush, I simply go like this, and sometimes you'll splatter it on your page, and then you have to live with that. But you know what? I'm not perfect, and I'm still learning. Okay, here we go. Like, so much faster, right? Now you'll notice that my shapes are getting a little bit more globby. It's because I have too much paint on the brush. And controlling that while adding new pigments to your brush and mixing with the brush the whole time is probably one of the most annoying parts. But you know what? Here we are. We're doing the thing. I've got this nice burgundy color happening now, which is really fun. And you go like that. You notice that one was a lot thinner because I have a lot less paint on my brush. Let's zoom in. Picking up some paint, mixing it in the tub. Laying down the color. A lot better. As I add more of this pigment, more of this teal color to the page, it's gonna start thickening up the paint. Right now it's quite viscous, and eventually it'll get very thick. How much water you add to your pan changes the consistency of the paint. How much water you're adding to your original color that you're mixing into changes the thickness of the paint. Controlling the amount of water is probably the most important part of gouache paint, and it is so annoying to try and do all the time. But once you get used to it, I think it turns out better. So we have a nice step from bright red all the way down to brown over here, and I think it's turned out pretty well. I'm going to keep going with this and see if I can get us all the way to green, and we'll speed this up a bit. Brush is splitting a little bit at the top. It's creating this little like stagnant mark. That's okay with me right now, but eventually I'm going to want it to be a little bit more solid. Okay, and with this last one, we are almost at bright green. So now from red all the way to green, we have created a huge gradient that even gets quite gray in the middle. I think it's interesting. At this point, I have this really nice green in here, and I want to show you what it's like when we add white and how different it acts when compared to this red and this green. White is the trickiest part of gouache and drives me the most insane. So here we go. There we go. You'll notice when I pick up white, it is quite pigmented right from the get-go. Even on my brush, it's very, very bright. And that is going to change how quickly the color changes dramatically. So I mix it in here. It also doesn't want to mix in as well as the other colors. I don't know what it is about white gouache, but it immediately makes everything pale. It took about 5 steps for the color to really thicken up, and that's interesting with white. Some colors do this better than others. I've noticed that black and white do it very well, and so does ultramarine. I don't know why, but it's just something about those pigments that gets really thick really quickly, like almost to like almost pastel consistency. Still using this little cup here, and it's really controlling the color well. We're all the way at this teal color, and there's no streaking in the paint that happens when you're on your palette. There's no anything of that kind. Having this little cup is a game changer with with your gouache paints, and I would highly recommend getting some sort of container like this, something that has walls, something that you can tip, something that can just easily mix the color. Oh, you can see there I didn't quite mix the paint enough, so I'm going to keep mixing a little bit extra this time, making sure I get everything. Sometimes streaks happen when you apply the paint. I really hate how that looks. It looks amateurish to me, but sometimes you can do it with intention. The color is lightening fairly nicely, but you'll see I've lost all the saturation basically immediately. If I had mixed in a yellow white, I think that would have been better. I'm still struggling to find how to get the lightness that I need in different shades. Like, what if I want a light purple that's not pale? It's tough. And as I move away from this project into the next couple of months, I'm going to be experimenting with that. How can I get lightness? How can I get a sense of depth and brilliance in these colors without getting everything so pale? Because I don't like my colors to be pale. I like vivaciousness and brightness and really exciting tones. But here we are. We've got this nice seafoam color. Now at this point, I can tell that if I don't cut the color soon, I'm going to take forever to get to white. I need to get rid of some of this blue pigment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set down my brush. I'm going to get my little rag over here. I'm actually just going to pour out some of the tone. And that is cutting the color. By pouring out the tone there, I'm removing some of the blue pigment from the mixture. And now when I mix in the white, I will have a much faster time getting there. I feel like people don't think about cutting, like look at that, that's so much brighter. I feel like people don't think about cutting the color when it comes to watercolors or even gouache, and they should. You should think like an oil painter when you're working with gouache, and that's such a weird thing to say, but... Oh, didn't mix enough. No, mix please. Okay, I hate mixing on the canvas. Da-da-da! At some points, you'll see that my streakiness is still persisting, and that just tells me I need to wash my brush. So let's do that. If you're not rinsing out your brush very often, you're probably going to get buildup in the ferrule area, and it's going to give you mistakes, and we don't like that. We say no, no. Okay, try again. Get some more white. Ah, so much better. Mix it in. Less streaks. Ooh, that's a good one. Nice. When I'm working with oil paints, I tend to mix with a palette knife, so the idea of mixing with a brush is still kind of foreign to me. I wonder if other gouache artists use something else to mix, because it is challenging to mix with the brush, and I feel like I'm abusing the brush a little bit. Getting pretty close to white. At this point, it would actually be wiser for me to start with white and go backwards, but I don't have white in a pile here. I also want you to notice, as the colors are drying, do you notice them darkening? Like, these are quite a bit darker already than when I put them down. And these ones, you can kind of see the edges showing up. You think this color is really light, but you're wrong. It's actually quite dark, and you have to keep adding white to it. At this point, I'm just finishing the piece with some pure white from the pan. I want to demonstrate how different my mixed color was with actual white, and how even the brush that I've been using has been picking up pigment and is changing the color. It's interesting to see how much the paint darkens up once you apply it to the paper. It doesn't stay brilliant white. Even after a couple of seconds of applying it, that first color is so much darker. That's one of the most frustrating parts about gouache, is that the lights don't stay light, and you have to get really thick with the paint, like right here, for it to even show up like that. Okay, so I'm editing right now, and I was like looking over at this. Do you see how different the color is from when I applied it? Like that little spot right there in the middle, that's the color I mixed versus how it's dried around the outside. It's so much darker. I hate this. I would show you this, but it's still wet, and that's my final thing I've noticed about gouache, is that when you paint thick, it takes forever to dry, and you have to go have lunch or something. You would think I would be patient with all the oil painting I do, but yet this medium is frustrating because it doesn't do anything you want it to do. However, I think the colors and I think the possibilities of what you can achieve with gouache are sublime, are super, super good. They're fantastic, and it makes me want to keep going. So I'm going to keep going. I'm going to do another update at 60 days and then 92 days as I complete a summer's worth of gouache painting, of trying to make and master this medium and do something interesting with it in the long run. Can I make an abstract piece, kind of like what I've got going over here? Can I make something that is wonderful with gouache that will lend itself to my collections as a whole? I don't know. I hope so, because I'm invigorated by this medium. There's something really brilliant about learning something new, and gouache has been my challenge this last month. It's been making me feel more creative. It's been giving me frustrations that I don't feel with oil painting, but also it's easier in some ways than oil painting. I don't know. I think you should give it a try. If you have any questions about gouache paint, or you want to see more materials or different kinds of mediums, or I should try a different brand, let me know, because I will give it a test. It's very fun. If you've enjoyed today's episode of Brushwork Podcast, leave me a little comment saying what you would like to see next time. Do you want to see more gouache content? Do you want to see oil painting content? Do you want to see something else? Let me know, because I would love to hear from you. Till next time, I hope you have a great day. Make good choices, everyone, and toodles! Bye-bye!